Cody, Wyoming. Today we're here with the one and only William F. Cody at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West Museum. Now this is truly a world-class museum. In fact, it's 5 world-class museums under one roof. There's a Buffalo Bill Museum focusing on the life and times of Bill Cody. The Draper Natural History Museum, which really focuses on nearby Yellowstone National Park. There's a fascinating Plains Indian museum. The Whitney Western Art Museum, which is just incredible. Several original Frederick Remingtons and Charlie Russells among others. And then there's, of course, the Cody Firearms Museum, which is why we're here today. We've been fortunate enough to be invited to take a look at some really fascinating Winchesters. Now, this Cody Firearms Museum, among other collections, houses the Winchester Factory Reference Collection and the original factory records from Winchester. So really, for us serious Winchester collectors, the world revolves around this building behind us. Let's go in and take a look around, and we'll take a closer look at some really fascinating Winchesters. Well, here we are in the inner sanctum of the Cody Firearms Museum. For those of us who collect, and particularly collect Winchesters, this is just a fantastic experience to be able to spend some time down here in the basement of the museum. And we've got a couple of really fascinating Winchester prototypes to show you today. Now, most people who are into Winchesters know that there were some prototype revolvers made early on. And most of us kind of lump them together as all kind of one project. But the reality of it is that there was a group of prototype revolvers made fairly early on in the mid-1870s, and then another project that took place almost a decade later in the 1880s. Now that first project that started out in the early 1870s really was about the same time frame that Colt had developed their 1873 or Model P single action army revolver. And they were going after government contracts and did well because they got the U.S. military contract for those 1873 single action armies. Smith & Wesson was a little ahead of the game because they had the patent for the drilled through cylinder design. And so up until that patent ran out in the early 1870s, nobody else could use that design. So they were still in the percussion revolver mode. And when that patent ran out, Colt was pretty quick to get into revolvers. Winchester, of course, had been lever actions focused up to that point, but they were looking at expanding. So they hired a couple of firearms designers from Smith & Wesson, Wetmore and Wells, William Wetmore and Charles Wells, in the mid-1870s to prototype some designs for metallic cartridge revolvers. Now here's a display for the Winchester prototype revolvers, and the Mason prototype, of course, is missing because we've pulled it out to take a closer look. But here are the Wetmore and Wells, supported by Stephen Wood and Hugo Borchardt in their development of the earlier Winchester prototypes. Now they went through 3 or 4 different iterations of this prototype. It looks surprisingly like a number 3 Smith & Wesson, except with a solid frame and fixed cylinder. And of course, Wetmore and Wells were hired away from Smith & Wesson, so it's really not that big a surprise. We went through different designs, trying to figure out exactly how to get the ejection system. This first one was kind of a automatic ejection system that never quite worked right. Then they went to a little lever to pull those out and eject them, and that didn't quite work right. And then they settled on Stephen Wood's design, which was a swing-out cylinder, which was way ahead of its time. It would have been fascinating if these had ever gone into production to see how popular they may have become. Now this one swings out to the left-hand side, and there's another one in the collection that actually swings out to the right-hand side, more like what the more modern versions of today, and a little more convenient than swinging out to this side. If you're right-handed, then you have to switch hands to load So the other one's a little bit more convenient in that regard. Now, Winchester wasn't able to secure any contracts, any government contracts for these early designs. So it really kind of was mothballed for a while. And by the way, if you look at this one, considering that Wetmore and Wells had been stolen away from Smith & Wesson, you can see there's definitely a design similarity to the break top number 3 Smith & Wessons. Now, of course, this one has a solid frame, much more like the Colt single action Army, with a cylinder that's stable in the frame. Except, of course, this one's a swing out. Now, for a number of years afterwards, Winchester had abandoned the revolver program entirely, until in 1883, 2 things happened. One, they stole William Mason away from Colt, and William Mason was one of Colt's most important designers. He'd been involved in the revolver design from the time that they started trying to make metallic cartridge revolvers, initially with the conversion revolvers, and then with the 1871, 1872 open tops. He was involved in the single action Army 1873 design, and then in the early double action Colt revolvers, the 1877 and the 1878. But in 83, he went over to Winchester, and at the same time, Colt started designing a lever action rifle. There's a lot of conjecture about the 2 things being related. But anyway, the first thing that William Mason did in Winchester's employ was to start designing another prototype revolver. Now again, this is several years after the Wetmore and Wells prototype revolvers were designed. So what we see here with the revolver design that William Mason came up with, and by the way, the Stephen Wood, who came up with this swing out cylinder design, was also involved with Mason on this design. But we see the back end of this revolver, the back half of it, looks very, very similar to the 1878 Colt revolvers that William Mason had designed for Colt. And the front end, there are a couple of different designs of this. The front end on this one is pretty similar to what we see with the Colt single action Army. There's another one out there that actually has the entire front end of a Remington revolver with its ejection system on it. So really the look of this one is that it was thrown together rather hastily to maybe show Colt that we're thinking about designing and coming out with a revolver to compete with Colt, because now you guys have come out with a lever action rifle. Now if you watch my episode on the Colt Burgess lever action rifle, I talk a lot about the supposed meeting that happened between the president of Winchester and the president of Colt concerning this particular revolver and the Colt Burgess lever action rifle. If you can go back, and I actually talk about the Winchester executive Edwin Pugsley give us a brief recollection of T.G. Bennett, who was the president of Winchester at the time and represented Winchester in that meeting, about the conversation that went on between the president of Winchester and the president of Colt. And really, you have to understand that at the time, Winchester and Colt had a very cordial relationship. In fact, they shared some of their marketing in Europe. And of course, marketing in those days wasn't like it is today electronically. It was face-to-face. So when a salesman from Colt or Winchester went to Europe, they marketed not only their own firearms, but what they considered the competitors' firearms. So this isn't one of those things where T.G. Bennett went into the president of Colt and started slamming his fist on the table, and you will stop making lever action rifles, and then we won't make any more of these prototype revolvers. But really the reality is, to me, and of course this is conjecture, is that this was a very serious attempt to make a marketable competitive revolver with these Wetmore and Well revolvers. And this really was probably more just, we put something together very quickly to be able to take to Colt to maybe come up with some agreement that would be acceptable to both of us, where we'll just kind of stay out of each other's hair. And after that, then Winchester really stayed out of the revolver market for the rest of its existence. Now, they did come up with some kind of odd prototype 22 revolvers were kind of a bolt action design many years later, but that was completely different. This gentleman's agreement that there's been a lot of conjecture about over the years really held for decades and decades afterwards. Now, I want to thank the Cody Firearms Museum for letting me bring these just incredible historic revolvers out and handle them today and get to show you. This particular revolver is, we believe it's in 44 WCF. The Wetmore and Wells revolvers actually were chambered in two different calibers, a 38-50 and a 40-50, which, in thinking about it, of course, they were never put in, those calibers or cartridges were never put into production because the revolvers didn't go into production. But if you think about those, it really brings to mind some very interesting calibers that we never got to see. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode. A big thanks to the Cody Firearms Museum and Danny Michaels, the curator, who set this all up for us. Until next time, happy trails from the Cinnabar, or from the Cody Firearms Museum.
It's all right.